You ready? I think Duncan gave the leading question. I didn't prompt him, but I tried to get you hold of it earlier, Duncan, but you were busy. I mean, this is all about data. I mean, we're big into data. I mean, we've got masses of data results and things like that. And for those who don't know, we process the RWA PY returns. I think that was mentioned in comments. So we've got a lot of results data in our database, a lot of entries data. And what that means is we can start to do things with it. And I think Duncan was hinting on some of that. So you might have seen that I spoke at the International Savings Summit last week in Metz. It is online, we did stream that and covered it. Well worth it, not to see my presentation, which was pretty boring, but there was a very interesting presentation from Terry, the membership manager of British Cycling. And British Cycling are awesome, I'm afraid, Duncan. You know, they've got their act together, but I think some of that's coming soon. But what they're doing is end-to-end data in terms of they know exactly who's participating, what events there are and so forth. And allegedly they've grown participation by 500%, and that's because they're drilling down to the data. They've put a lot of effort into it, and I think, as John says, we're doing some of that here, we're joining it up, you know, it's great to see, you know, the RWA, so I think we can get there. But what was clear, and I spent a lot of time talking to Terry both at the meeting and sort of before it, is they're really using data to drill down and answer those questions. You know, they're getting to that sort of aim away in terms of knowing exactly what happens, and that what can be happening in the database. What I'm going to show here is some of the work that we've been doing on our participation data, and that's using sort of data that we've got collecting, sort of in a way mashing it up. In a way, don't worry too much about what we're showing, and if I can show some of it later to anyone on the computer. But by collecting the data and analysing, so you know this is showing, you know, participation by class and things like that. We can actually drill down. I'm not going to try and demonstrate it here, but I'll put it on the computer anyway later. But drill down by class, gender, and things like that. So if you want to see, I mean, this is entry data, and it's a lot of RWA data. So it's very south-centric and so forth. But what this is a heat map, shows lots of entries. That doesn't mean there's lots of only sailing happens in the south. That's just our database. If we process your databases, we get lots of blips there. But you know, it shows some interesting things. We can drill down by age, gender, you know, any of the sort of demographics to get there, and just really see where people are sailing and things like that. I'm going to just flick through some of these charts. This one is showing number of clubs, number of boats, and things like that. But let me just. But we can drill down by club, and there's been a bit of a thread, and I guess some of these guys have been involved in that thread, haven't they, in terms of participation data. And I think there's obviously a need to collect data. I don't know, perhaps Duncan can explain why, things like Sports England and things like that. So there's a need to measure it, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, if you receive an Inspired Facilities grant, for example, from Sport England, you're compelled to report against that. Obviously, from an RWA point of view, we report to our board and our chief executive and our committee around what's going on. So there's some information that we use to understand the output of our work and the direction of our future work. But equally, I think a lot of the value is in asking pertinent questions in order to shape the direction of your own club in a way.
Yeah.
So,
and that's what we're trying to do here. So there's perhaps a central reason, but I think, you know, in a way you hit the nail on the head. That's what we realised with some of the emails flying around. There's a need to know from the club's perspective.
Well, I think genuinely what we have seen this year is a number of clubs being surprised, and including us, particularly. Some of us are from a racing background, for example, and you get a little bit pigeonholed in your thinking of what participation is. But a number of clubs have been tremendously surprised at the volume of recreational and training participation, and they found that the offer, if you like, that they were delivering to their recreational members was out of proportion with the volume of activity taking place. So because it happens on a Tuesday afternoon, you don't know it's happened. And there's actually, so a lot of clubs have gone, crikey, actually we can do a far better job for these people, and if we've got this number of people already, must be a latent demand for more people if we do a better job. So there's a hidden participation that we don't see on a Sunday afternoon.
And I think what we've realised is we can bring some of that out of the data, which was really your question a few minutes ago, by showing, you know, this is a participation chart in terms of months and things like that. Again, don't get worried too much about it. But one of the ones that we found that was very interesting, I believe there's a question, 10 or more sessions, that seems to have cropped up. Well, you know, we've been coding this over, but that's quite difficult to calculate because you'll see. But
That's the hardest one.
Yeah, but if we've got the results data, it's a bit of a nested SQL query. If anyone's into databases, it's not a simple one, but you know we can do it out. And what we've realised is we can report. I mean, this is, I don't know, say Delph or something like that. So we've got Gareth Davis who hit 51 sessions. I mean, it's an interesting figure, but actually the most interesting one is the chart down there. It's Duncan Trustwater has never been sailing or whatever, one there. We've got his data on a database, we can work it out. And I think what we
He's the one at risk of not renewing.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Duncan's, you know, black sheep or whatever, he's a bit busy. You know.
I didn't use the bar.
In the bar. So data can be useful in terms of reporting who's doing well and so forth, but actually it's more useful of who's not doing well. And that one of the questions was, and that's what the Alliance is about, is that we've got all this data, but it's in there, it's all over the place, isn't it? And we're working hard together to integrate it. So at the moment we're taking entries and results, and we'll come on to talk about results in a minute, but we're already doing some work with John and Richard about taking duties into this, and there's no reason why we couldn't take recreation sailing. So we've built a whole dashboard that's taking all these bits of software that everyone's using and bringing it together into something that you can sit down in your committee and see, what's happening, what's the state of the nation of your club, and start to understand where are the good points, where are the things that need sort of adjusting. And I think what we've realised is we're at sort of a cusp of something really exciting. I think it's great the Alliance is working together, and great that we come to clubs and are sort of supporting. I think working together, why should British cycling be doing 500%? We should be well up there. Now, what I found interesting, I mean, British cycling has far less members than the RWA.
It's creeping up now.
It's creeping up, it's getting there.
Yeah, they're not dissimilar now.
Yeah, but
there's a slightly different dynamic with cycling.
It's not quite the same marketplace or the same sort of audience, is it?
Well, and you're compelled to join actually.
Yeah.
So if you do any sort of cycling event, and pretty much all of the cycling events are processed by the cycling website.
Well, that's right. There's some of that you've obviously.
But for insurance reasons, you have to join.
You have to join, and the event has to join as well. So there's lots of liabilities and insurance. Not necessarily saying that's the answer, but what was clear 10 years ago, cycling was a basket case of sport. Well, it might be a bit more than that, but not long ago, it was very parochial, I think. And they showed by using data, analysing the data, they've really grown. They've had some lucky breaks like Sky, but actually they admit Sky wasn't completely the answer. It solved it.
I mean, they've done a great job.
And things like that.
How have they measured recreational cycling? Because that's one of our challenges. You've got this results data, but how do you measure someone just going out for a ride?
Well, so if you enter any cycling event, it's solely done via their system. So say if I enter a sportive on the Isle of Wight, they are at that point, but it's asking you questions about your recreational participation. So actually, because effectively you've got a single point of, and the RWA doesn't believe that we should impose a system on every club in the country. Do you know what I mean? Or a standard result system. It's not the right thing to do.
Well, you can have feeds of all the ones that are there.
Yes, but
that would be worse, isn't it?
Recreational, sorry to interrupt you. Recreational sailing can be measured by people who visited the club.
Yes.
And they've got to go down the slipway, haven't they?
The trick is to capture them entering the club. Automatically.
Yes.
So it may be easier.
So feeds from access control systems, from bar systems.
Yeah, and we talked about having a little scan or something like that as you launch and things. There are ways of doing it, and actually you're right that they've got to come somewhere, haven't they? You can wander down to the coast and just go, but most sailing will go down the slipway at some point.
Can I ask a question? I'm fully supportive of the notion that we would want to know better what's going on and analyse the data in this way. Is there a voice coming from anywhere at all that says, actually, I go out sailing on a Tuesday afternoon, I don't want to be monitored or counted, I don't want actually anyone, I'm not going to put my activities down in an app, I'm not interested, I just want to get out on the water, do my thing, come back in, go in home for my dinner, and I don't like the idea of being counted at all. Is anyone coming out with that at all? It must be. I'm beginning to feel as if I don't want to be monitored day in, day out on my activities.
I think several thought on this. But my thoughts on that are that you have to do some extrapolation. So you're going to get.
So it's a best.
Yeah, you're going to get a load. Obviously, the racing you can report very accurately, and you can extrapolate not very much. Once you've gathered all the results, system data together, you don't extrapolate. the whole duties system, that tells you how many volunteers are out. You can extrapolate from that. And of course that also tells you about events that are running that might not have popped up in your race databases, but it shows that there were events going on in these clubs because their volunteers on the water running. You do a bit of extrapolation on that. You can then offer things like the apps to people who say, I went sailing and came back in, or your till system or your access control system, you do that, and extrapolate from that. And then you do some surveys to try to find out who are the few who are still, the adventure sailor who just wants to go and nobody to know he's there. But you can add those in, and then I think...
And get a good enough idea.
Synonymousy extrapolation rules would stand a bit of audit by anybody who wants to look at them. I think we could then
I'm sure there are, to be honest. In answer to your question, I'm sure there are. The challenge is we also want a huge amount of investment. So the government's put 23.3 million into, and most of that's gone into sailing club facility upgrades, because we were unique amongst most sports that we had a very, very aging facility stock. Almost every sailing club was built 60s, 70s. And the clubs, we've been very obsessed with keeping the cost of membership down, rightly so, that we haven't actually set aside a war chest to upgrade our facilities. So there was a huge need to upgrade the stock. So we've done really well, the clubs have done really well with our support to apply for this money, but we still need loads more to get the sailing clubs to the standard of which that your
The
Mm.
sports
newcomers
facilities
expect.
that
Yeah,
people are wanting.
because if you go into a gym nowadays, it's poles apart from our standard old changing rooms, and that's what people are becoming to expect. Whereas it's not me, if you know what I mean. I grew up in drafty cobweb changing rooms, and
But the
I walk in
newcomers
and-
want a nice
yeah.
flash.
So sometimes we
Have to
Yeah.
report to get the thing. But yes,
Yeah.
it's a means to an end in some ways.
Yeah,
And
so I guess
yes.
that's the argument for those people who don't like being counted.
Do
Is,
you want-
if we're going to try and reinvest at all in our facilities, then help us by doing that. That would be the case.
But I think it also helps the club, as we say, managing what you offer the club, offer your customers, effectively.
It does, but when you're selling it to, dare I say it, some of the older members who don't like technology and never done it that way and what have you, I've sort of tried to sell it at our club is, well, we're getting help and support from the RYA, and it's a bit of you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours, and we need to support them. And that's gone down a lot better in encouraging them to sort of fill in the log.
So it has at
Who's
Cransley
been there.
as well. I think Nigel would say the same about Cransley Sailing Club.
I think the thing you don't want to do is turn a day at the sailing club to like another day at work.
You've got to make it as
Swipe
easy as
card
you
this,
can.
swipe card
Yeah.
that. Because it is free time, and you take the word free as wide as you like.
In terms of participation and stuff from the RYA point of view, I've looked at the foot. Now, if you ask how many people have done a training course, that's an easy answer. How many people have done a race, that's an easy answer. How many people have done 10 sessions? It's impossible unless you've got a tagging on system. And then, if it's impossible, we're talking about extrapolation, that's guesswork. And then those numbers are going in, and then we're doing well or we're doing badly, and it's all based on guesswork.
I think
If the things were correctly asked, even how many people were out every day of the week, we could do 20 that day, just count them up on the wall and put a number in. Be a lot closer than asking how many people
Yeah.
done 10 sessions.
Whether the questions are right or wrong is a different debate, but to some extent I agree that the questions, there are some questions which are tremendously challenging from a practical point of view to answer.
Exactly.
There's some pros and some cons. So I actually moved into the role at the point in time where the questions were kind of predetermined, and I looked long and hard about whether to pull some of these questions out, because my sense was that it's tremendously hard.
It is.
However, what we do know is the data suggests that 10 sessions is a really good measure of the threshold of whether you might actually get that person to join. So if you've kept them for 10 sessions of a start sailing course, there's a good likelihood they're going to carry on. And given that, you have a tricky choice about, do you ask a very difficult question which encourages you know, it focuses in on, it's actually something that ideally we would know, but we don't. We know it's important to know it, but we don't know it.
But if you say after 10 sessions they become members, when I ask the question, do they become a member? Because that's a yes no answer. And it's a one-off. 90% of the people that do courses here are members.
Yeah.
So that's a tick in the box. I mean, you do that without any thought. But the 10 sessions, not racing, no electronic tagging system to tag people on, it is literally all.
I mean, if you've got a register, it's kind of doable, but yet we
don't even register.
I mean, some clubs have found it relatively easy and some, frankly, impossible. But it is all about the systems you have in place. And I don't believe we did a good job of helping the clubs with the systems that they might require in order to answer the question.
But at the very top level, you should decide what numbers you want, and then say, well, how are we going to get those numbers? I think maybe we have to systems. We have to talk to these guys and say what numbers
Well,
out.
you're talking to us now.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to come was because we haven't determined the questions for next year. So
Excellent.
we were a lot more intelligent than we were. You could see stark differences actually in retention rates across the country, albeit people have interpreted it in an inconsistent fashion. You'd hope that they've interpreted it in a consistent fashion, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
I think one of the other things we've got to recognise is that a number of the questions are for the RYA to be able to talk to UK Sport, and they're actually, UK Sport want to be able to compare sports because they're choosing where the money goes. So somebody who's going cycling, 10 sessions, maybe a different, we know kind of in terms of setup time and 20 minutes going running may be quite different from 3 hours going sailing, and how easily you can do a 20-minute run 3 times a week, whereas actually to go sailing more than once a week is a huge commitment.
Yeah.
So sometimes it feels to me like the 10 sessions is actually quite an unfair commitment. For us, if we get somebody who comes to the club 4 or 5 times, they're actually pretty committed.
Absolutely. I would agree.
Yeah, you could do it on hours based, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Well, then the session needs to be defined more readily as
Yeah.
well.
In terms of sessions, we've had to decide that if they're coming at lunchtime, then it's 2 sessions. But actually, you then look at an open meeting which starts at 11:30 and they do 3 races back to back. Is that 2 sessions or 1 session? Or
3
one
sessions.
session? Well, we only
Exactly.
count it as 1.
Yeah.
Because they are actually-
Hours participating.
Yeah.
could be. Yeah.
That's the direct correlation, isn't it?
That's real monitoring everybody what they're doing, isn't it?
Estimating, extrapolating.
You've got information about racing, haven't you, but by race results?
Yes, I'm not particularly worried about the race.
It's the race.
It's not racing, recreational.
I think there's
And is a session, coming to the club, having a coffee and going, is that a session or not?
I mean, a typical example here is you do a level 1, level 2 course, level 1 course, let's say, over a weekend, which I think is only allowed to count as 2 sessions because it's 2 days, because we asked the question, is that,
Well, I mean, our own team, to be honest, wouldn't have interpreted the response in a consistent fashion, I
Yes.
doubt. You know, we've got 7 regional development officers and probably 25 sailing development officers, and for me that's, it hasn't been a perfect system. But we are more intelligent than we were, thanks to you guys spending the time and effort doing it. But for me, the most important bit is that it makes you guys more intelligent, actually.
That's what I was going to say. It's, as long as we as a club from Grafham, we count our units the same way, then next year we can compare with this year on a consistent basis and see either the increase or the decline.
I think
And the fact that our sessions are actually different from yours kind of doesn't worry me too much.
We
Looking
don't
from a
actually
Grafham point of
report
view.
the 10 sessions thing to, we don't report that to an external agency at the moment. We're really interested in the inputs. So there's a bucket of participation, let's say. We know it's a leaky bucket, people are dropping off. We like the start sailing first experience because it's a measure of how effectively we are filling up the bucket, and if we get them to stay, whether that's to club membership or 10 sessions or however you define it, then
One is what's easier to define than the other. Because when they've done their training, they're not going to go racing. That's the last thing they're going to do. They're going to go and try and rig that Wayfarer again and go a little toot around the bay when nobody's there. And you can't count that.
Well, what's interesting for us is we just did the club membership census, and headlines are, which will all be played back to you before Christmas, is in every region, club membership on average is growing, which is a picture that we haven't seen until recently. But one of the things we added in a question about that, which we were curious about, we had things in about capacity, so where we can most help people, because a lot of the clubs in the south and the southeast are pretty much full. So where do we spend our money and our time? Is things that, and the other thing that was really interesting is 43% of clubs had to estimate the number of new and expiring, retiring, leaving, lapsing members. That's really surprising. So that we got a bit of flack for that because they didn't know. They didn't know how many people, they know how many members they've got, they don't know how many people have joined and left. They only know the list was this many last year and this many this year. See, you put a question in thinking some clubs are going to be challenged about that. But actually, hopefully they'll think, we need to know that actually for their own benefit.
Absolutely.
But it's not a perfect system.
Or even it's much easier to measure, in my opinion.
Than activity.
Things like 10 sessions. That's the hardest part, I would say. The current.
What scope is there to design the questions around the data we can actually collect? You know, we don't want to focus the result, but just to
be pragmatic, isn't it?
be pragmatic.
Plenty to be honest, but the other thing is it's against the portfolio of other information available. So we have pretty good data from the Sporting and Active People Survey, which gives us an indication of weekly participation. But actually we're a tremendously niche sport, and so sailing's niche. And then when you get windsurfing, yacht sailing, dinghy cruising, recreation, it gets even nicher. So you end up with some really spurious outcomes, because even though that's the biggest survey that this country runs, it's not effective for a sport like ours. Plus the 30-minute thing which you talked about, when our lowest average duration is 2 hours 48 minutes for any of our disciplines. So we try and supplement it with the things that we don't know. It's pointless knowing something twice. You either know it or you don't, if you like. So
could you agree a sort of multiplier that if there's this many people completing a race, then there must be this many people times X just going sailing?
No.
Depends on the club, isn't it?
Very different.
Some clubs is race. That's what we do.
Can I just throw in another part to this as well? I don't know what is going to be the final outcome of the CASC guidelines that come out in January, and one of the bits that we're sort of paying attention to will be involvement in a club, and to what extent you're able to monitor and track involvement. And the gentleman over in the corner there, we raised the point, people are coming down to tinker about with a boat and have a coffee and then go home, or they're helping to run the club and not have anything to do with on the water activity. And
Just coming down
this
to be
is also
sociable.
Participation in the club. We need to pay attention to that. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we start to monitor it, but if eventually we're required to demonstrate involvement of these additional people who never go out on the water in order to justify our status as a CASC registered club.
We often try and negotiate blanket exemptions to things like that on the back of the information that
you
the
get
clubs
from,
have been given.
Yeah.
So we can say, look, this is mad, you can't ask every club that. We can tell you 35% of the clubs are or aren't, or 80%, things like that, so can't we just agree? And on occasions that'll be accepted.
So that's an extrapolation that you suggested. If you've got this many sailing, there's probably this many involved.
Yeah, you can sample and scale.
It's surprising the amount of data we can pick up off duty now. It's not just about supporting races, but supporting other things. We can drill into what the clubs call their events. So that wasn't a race, was it? That was a rally to have a picnic or something. I'm thinking about quite descriptive titles sometimes. But also work party, rebuilding the dunes, painting the boat shed. It appears that you have to do a lot of extrapolation because you're getting that off a few clubs. A few clubs doing that. They probably all are. Just not many of them choose to put it in their duty man roster or whatever.
But that to me is the power of the data. Is if you're sharing it, then you can compare and contrast, as you said, how you worked out last year, what's changed between last year and this year. But equally, then from the RYA feeding back in terms of what was the norm, and then it doesn't matter that you're different to the norm, because at least then you can start asking the question as to why you're different. And yeah, that's because we've got a lot more social members, or we're purely racing, and it's just that, to have that feedback as well, I think is really important.
And this is a bit of a shameless plug, but there was an insights document sent out in the summer. Did anybody see that? It's about 20 pages, but it was it was some of the best information that we've seen to give to clubs to make them more intelligent. Did anybody?
Oh, I certainly haven't seen
Where is that sent to? Plus secretaries or?
It was a link with the membership census or the membership survey. It's in the. There's been quite a lot of press releases about it. It's in the club section of the RWA website.
Is it about the previous year's participation figures?
There's all sorts of stuff. Average club size, cast versus non-cast against certain participation, barriers to participation.
I think it was attached to the reminder of the participation survey that I had.
People's perceptions about the sport, because the purpose of replaying that along with the data is, if you understand what people's perceptions are, you understand what your website needs to look like to challenge those perceptions against, around newcomers, for example. Because one of the really interesting, if you look at the perceptions barriers to participation, is people are obviously worried about the cost of equipment and everything else like that, but there's a massive investment gone in recently into club-owned boats. But we use the website to talk about us and our races and things like that, and actually from the perspective of the customer, if you thought of it as your shop window, your front page would be something along the lines of, you don't need to own a boat, we've actually got 10 club-owned boats that you can hire for a £5 a time, or do you know what I mean? And we try and give that back so that you as clubs can have a debate around what you need your shop window to be like.
A nice feed off the booking system for those boats. There's another bit of data.
Yeah, it's very true.
So, I've probably shown enough about what can be done with data. I think it's good to bring John in at this stage. We're collecting data, say, from the scoring programs, and John can say he's one of the key parts of it. The next thing is a bit of a sort of housekeeping thing, that to make the data useful, it needs to be clean. So, for example, we're doing the PY returns and things like that, and it's surprising the problems we have with names and class things. The RS Fever XL, the Pico, whatever. I think we've got about 100 Picos in our database. Probably more Picos in the classification and so forth. So, as we get into this big data thing, there's a need for sort of keeping the data clean and so forth. Now, SailWave is obviously one of the leading scoring programs. I think John perhaps give us a few hints and tips of how we can do some of that together.
Right. Hi, I'm John Estelle. SailWave was originally written by Colin Jenkins, which I'm sure you all knew many years ago. For about the last 5 or 6 years I've been writing add-ons to it, and then for the last 3 years I've been the sole developer of SailWave. It's well established, it's used worldwide, not just in the UK, but it's very busy in Australia and New Zealand and all that as well at the moment. And it supports cruisers and the dinghies as well, and right down to windsurfing, right through the whole family of sailing. There is information on the SailWave website, so you have a look there, and if anybody's really interested in it, they can actually join the SailWave user group, which is free of charge. It's not run by SailWave, it's run by the users themselves. It's a SailWave user group, and there's about 2,500 active members on there at the moment. So you're welcome to join that and help support the other members as well. Feed it back to yourselves. It's a self-supporting sort of system. One of the things I was really going to talk about today was really, as Simon just suggested, is we can get all this data out of SailWave, but it is very important to actually make sure that what you're putting in is good data. Garbage in, garbage out is always the common saying. What you need to do is really to try and devise some standards within your club as to how you actually input the data. I mean, how do you call someone Andy, or do you call him Andrew? Now, as far as the computer's concerned, Andy and Andrew are two different people. I mean, you know they're the same, but the computer thinks, oh, Andy and Andrew is a different person. So when you try and merge results up into make series, if you've entered him as Andy in one race, one event, and Andrew in the next event, when you try and merge it with Sailway to make your series up, someone's got to go through and say, oh, stupid computer again, it's gone and put two different people in again. I'm going to have to go and merge those manually now. So.
What else are Monday mornings for? Results officer to tidy up what was done over the weekend.
I mean, if you can devise some way of doing this, you can save yourselves a lot of time and obviously get more accurate data, save yourself time, more time in the water, etc. There are a few ways of doing it. I mean, obviously by using something that's common like your membership names or that. I mean, I do a lot of scoring myself for windsurfing events, as some of you probably know. I always try and use what people registered as last year for the first event for the first year. So even if they've actually written down Andrew, I would actually try and then make that the standard for the rest of the year. But I'm bringing in what they've actually entered last year to check it against. So typically you can have Sailway can actually have excluded members. So I would actually bring in last year's events and mark them all as excluded, and then when people sign on, I'll actually match them against what's actually in there already and exclude them or change them to what they want to be called this year. Because you find that, especially the youngsters, they sort of like to change their names. You know, they're Andrew when they're young, but they're no longer Andrew when they're a bit older. Okay, so once you've then devised your standard, it makes your creating your series and all your other events and then all the data you want to report much easier. Okay, that was my real thing about.
Yeah, but that's going to become more important. I mean, I'm just about to do the PY returns. I think it's the 1st of December or whatever. So we've got a massive job in terms of merging all these people together to try and work out what the PYs are, which will be incredibly controversial, I'm sure. But if
I wouldn't own up to being responsible for that.
I think it's one of your colleagues, isn't it?
He's doing a club talk about that topic tonight.
All right. So, but we see the whole problem, and I sit on the PY group, and we all spend hours trying to work out what this PICO is and things like that. And it is funny, but actually it's not really when we look at the time going. And I think it's the people and the boats. I mean, ultimately, I think someone mentioned, we'll be able to enter in one system, and it will go, end to end. So there will only be really one centralised data that's got you as the member in it and goes through it. And I think we're stumbling towards that. But
I think I'm right in saying that we find that there are some classes that aren't consistent between RYA wide name and your names.
So the name you can put into Sailway is totally free.
Yes, but that actually does
cause problems.
If you could work on the same table, if we work on the assumption that the RYA returns have got everything in them, then if you could populate with the same, then we won't get anything else confused.
With John's tables, with John's system, you can download the current PY ratings. If that one's tied up correctly, but the thing is, a local club can then sit down and say, I don't like that name. At the club, we call it.
Or create your own class.
Rather than calling it a PICO, it's Fred's homegrown PICOs.
But the more discipline that you can impose that stops clubs actually doing that makes it easier for the clubs in the long run.
And